She was serving the last table, until the millionaire saw his lost daughter's childhood drawing in her wallet, and he froze. The clock above the kitchen door at the lantern read 11:47 p.m. when Eliza Monroe finally untied her apron strings. Her feet ached something fierce. 12 hours straight of taking orders, clearing tables, and forcing smiles at customers who treated her like she was invisible. But the double shift meant double tips. And double tips meant she could actually pay rent this month without choosing between electricity and groceries. She grabbed her worn leather purse from the employee locker, the same one she'd carried for the past 5 years. The zipper had given up the ghost months ago, held together now by sheer willpower and a safety pin. As she slung it over her shoulder and headed for the back exit, the safety pin chose that exact moment to surrender. "Oh, come on," Eliza muttered, watching helplessly as her entire life scattered across the restaurant's checkered linoleum floor. Loose change rolled in every direction, making tiny metallic pings as they found corners and crevices. Her phone skittered under a table. Receipts, gum wrappers, and crumpled dollar bills created a paper trail of her modest existence. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to collect the mess. Her cheeks burned with embarrassment, even though the dining room was nearly empty except for one lone customer nursing what had to be his 4th cup of coffee in the corner booth. That's when she saw it, a piece of paper she hadn't looked at in months, maybe longer. It had been tucked deep in her wallet's photo sleeve, yellowed with age and worn soft at the edges like an old love letter. But it wasn't a letter. It was a drawing, a child's drawing, done in fading crayon on construction paper. A little girl with pigtails stood next to a tall man in what looked like a business suit. Above them, in the shaky handwriting of someone who'd just learned to form letters, were the words, "Dad and me." Eliza stared at it, her heart doing something strange in her chest. This drawing was her only connection to a life she couldn't remember. The life before Miriam Lowell found her at St. Catherine's Children's Home 20 years ago, traumatized and silent, clutching this very piece of paper like it was a lifeline. "Excuse me, miss." The voice came from directly above her. Eliza looked up to find the lone customer from the corner booth standing over her, his coffee cup forgotten on the table behind him. He was older, maybe mid-50s, with salt and pepper hair and the kind of expensive suit that screamed money. But his eyes looked like they'd seen too much sadness for one lifetime. "I'm sorry," Eliza said quickly, stuffing papers back into her broken purse. "I didn't mean to disturb you. I'll be out of your way in just a—" "That drawing," the man interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. May I see it?" Something in his tone made Eliza freeze. She glanced down at the crayon drawing still clutched in her hand, then back up at the stranger's face. His skin had gone pale and his hands were actually shaking. "I don't understand," she said slowly. The man's legs seemed to give out. He sank into the nearest chair, never taking his eyes off the drawing. "Where did you get that?" "It's mine," Eliza said, instinctively protective. "I've had it since I was little." "How little?" The question came out sharp. Almost desperate, Eliza found herself studying his face more carefully. There was something familiar about his features, though she couldn't place what. The strong jawline, maybe. The way his eyebrows drew together when he concentrated. "Since I was 9, she heard herself saying. I lived at St. Catherine's Children's Home until Miriam adopted me. She said I had this drawing with me when they brought me in." The man made a sound like he'd been punched. "What's your name?" "Eliza Monroe." "What was it before?" "Before you were adopted." "I don't know." The admission tasted bitter. "I don't remember anything from before the home. The counselors said it was trauma-related memory loss. Sometimes kids just forget things that are too painful to remember." The man stood up so abruptly his chair scraped against the floor. For a moment, Eliza thought he might leave, just walk away and pretend this strange conversation had never happened. Instead, he moved closer, his gaze fixed on the drawing with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. "The man in the drawing," he said carefully. "Do you remember anything about him?" Eliza looked down at the faded crayon marks. She'd studied this drawing thousands of times over the years, searching for clues about who she used to be. The man wore a dark suit and had kind eyes, even rendered in a child's uncertain hand. The little girl, presumably her, looked happy, safe. "Nothing concrete," she admitted. Sometimes I think I remember his voice, but that might just be wishful thinking. Miriam always said I was found alone, that there were no leads about my family. Miriam, my adoptive mother, Miriam Lowell. She passed away 5 years ago. The familiar ache of loss settled in Eliza's chest. She was wonderful to me. She used to be a nun, actually, but she left the convent to take me in. Said God told her I needed a mother more than the church needed another sister. The man's expression shifted, something almost like recognition flickering across his features. A nun who left her vows to adopt you. That's right, she never told me much about my life before. Said it was better to focus on building new memories than dwelling on lost ones. But she kept the drawing because she knew it was important to me. Nathaniel Ainsworth, though Eliza didn't know his name yet, felt like he was drowning. 20 years. 20 years of searching, of hiring private investigators, of following dead-end leads that led nowhere. 20 years of wondering if his little girl was alive or dead, suffering or safe. And here she was, standing in front of him in a run-down diner, all grown up and beautiful and completely unaware that she was looking at her father. The drawing clinched it. He recognized every line, every careful stroke of crayon. Clara had made dozens of drawings just like it, always featuring the two of them together. She'd been obsessed with his business suits, thought they made him look important. Like a superhero, Daddy, she used to say. My name is Nathaniel Ainsworth, he said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion. And I think you might be my daughter. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they should cross. Eliza's grip on the drawing tightened. That's impossible, she whispered. But even as she said it, something deep inside her was stirring. A fragment of memory, or maybe just hope dressed up as remembering. I would know if I had a father looking for me. You disappeared 20 years ago, Nathaniel said. From our home in Nashville. You were 8 years old. Your name was Clara. Clara Ainsworth. Clara. The name hit her like a physical blow, sending shivers down her spine. For just a moment, she could almost hear someone calling that name, a voice filled with love and desperation. But then it was gone, slipping away like water through her fingers. I need to go, she said suddenly, backing toward the door. This was too much. Too fast. She'd spent her whole adult life accepting that her past was gone forever. And now this stranger was claiming to be her father based on a child's drawing. Please, Nathaniel said, taking a step forward. Please don't run. I know this sounds crazy, but I've been looking for you every day for 20 years. That drawing? Clara made dozens just like it. She loved drawing the two of us together. Eliza paused at the door, her hand on the handle. Against every rational thought in her head, she found herself turning back to look at him. Really look at him. The eyes were the same, in the drawing and in the man standing before her. The same kind, gentle eyes that somehow looked familiar despite everything her mind was telling her. If what you're saying is true, she said quietly, what happened to me? Why don't I remember? Nathaniel's face crumpled. I don't know, you just vanished. One day you were there, the next you were gone. The police searched everywhere, but it was like you'd disappeared into thin air. The silence stretched between them, filled with 20 years of questions and a lifetime of longing. Finally, Eliza pulled out a pen from her apron pocket and scribbled her phone number on a napkin. I need time to think about this, she said, handing it to him. But if you really believe I'm your daughter, maybe we should talk more, when I'm not falling apart in a diner at midnight. Nathaniel took the napkin like it was made of gold. Tomorrow. Could I call you tomorrow? Eliza nodded, not trusting her voice. Then she pushed through the door and stepped out into the cool Nashville night, leaving behind the strange man who claimed to be her father and carrying with her a drawing that might just hold the key to everything she'd lost. Behind her, Nathaniel sank back into his chair, staring at the napkin in his trembling hands. For the first time in 20 years, hope felt like more than just a 4-letter word. Eliza didn't sleep that night. She lay in her cramped studio apartment, staring at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a butterfly, if you squinted hard enough, turning the yellowed drawing over and over in her hands. Every time she closed her eyes, she could almost hear something, a voice maybe, calling a name that might have been hers. Clara. The name felt foreign on her tongue when she whispered it into the darkness. yet somehow familiar, like a song she'd heard long ago but couldn't quite remember the melody to. She'd tried saying it a dozen different ways, soft and gentle, the way a father might call his daughter for dinner, urgent and panicked, the way someone might shout if that daughter had gone missing. By 6 a.m., she'd given up on sleep entirely. She made coffee with grounds she'd used twice already. Times were tight, and good coffee was a luxury she couldn't afford, and sat by her single window watching Nashville wake up. The city looked different somehow, like she was seeing it through new eyes, or maybe old eyes that might have seen these streets before, when she was someone else entirely. Her phone buzzed at exactly 9 o'clock. "Eliza, this is Nathaniel, from last night." His voice sounded different over the phone, less shaky, more controlled, but still carrying that undercurrent of desperate hope that had made her chest tight in the restaurant. "I wasn't sure you'd actually call," she said, surprised by her own honesty. "I wasn't sure you'd answer." There was a pause, and she could hear papers rustling in the background. "I spent all night going through old files, looking at photos, Eliza. I need you to know. I'm not some crazy person making this up. I have evidence, lots of evidence." "What kind of evidence?" "Photos of Clara, medical records, school papers, her birth certificate." His voice caught slightly. "A police report from the day she disappeared." The bottom dropped out of Eliza's stomach. A police report made it real in a way that crayon drawings couldn't. What did the police say happened? "They said she was abducted from our home during a business party I was hosting. One minute she was there, the next she was gone. No witnesses, no leads, no trace." The pain in his voice was palpable. "I hired private investigators, put up rewards, never stopped looking, but after a while, everyone assumed that she wasn't coming back." Eliza closed her eyes, trying to imagine what that kind of loss would do to a person. 20 years of not knowing if your child was alive or dead, safe or suffering. 20 years of hope slowly curdling into grief. "I want to see the evidence," she said before she could lose her nerve. "If I really am Clara, I need to know what happened to me. Are you free today? I could come to you, or we could meet somewhere neutral, whatever makes you comfortable." Neutral ground. That seemed smart. "There's a coffee shop on Music Row called The Daily Grind. Do you know it? I'll find it." "What time?" 2 o'clock. "I'll be there." After he hung up, Eliza sat staring at her phone for a long time. Part of her wanted to call in sick to work, to spend the day researching Nathaniel Ainsworth and the disappearance of Clara Ainsworth, but she couldn't afford to lose a day's wages. And besides, keeping busy might help stop her mind from spinning in circles. The lunch shift at the Lantern dragged like molasses. Every time the door chimed, she looked up expecting to see Nathaniel, even though they weren't meeting until later. Her hands shook as she poured coffee and took orders, and she dropped more dishes than she had in months. "You okay, honey?" asked Martha, the head cook and closest thing to a mother figure Eliza had found since Miriam's death. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Something like that," Eliza muttered, wiping down the same table for the third time. "Want to talk about it?" Eliza glanced around the restaurant, making sure no one was listening. "Martha, what would you do if someone claimed to be related to you? Someone you'd never met before?" Martha raised an eyebrow. "Depends. Are they asking for money?" "No, nothing like that. It's more like..." Eliza struggled to find the words. "Like they think I'm someone I used to be, someone I can't remember being. Honey, I've known you for 3 years, and in all that time you've never talked about your family. Always figured there was a story there. There is, or there might be. I just don't know if it's true." Martha studied her with the kind of maternal concern that made Eliza's chest ache. "Well, seems to me you've got 2 choices. You can spend the rest of your life wondering, or you can find out for sure. Either way's scary, but only one of them gives you answers." At 1:45, Eliza found herself standing outside the Daily Grind, her palms sweating despite the cool October air. Through the window, she could see Nathaniel already seated at a corner table, a manila folder thick with papers spread out in front of him. He looked up as she entered, and his face transformed with something that might have been relief. "Thank you for coming," he said. Standing as she approached, up close in daylight, she could see the resemblance more clearly. The same nose, maybe. The same stubborn chin. Or maybe she was just looking for similarities that weren't really there. I almost didn't, she admitted, sliding into the chair across from him. I understand. This is overwhelming. He gestured to the folder. I brought copies of everything. I thought maybe if you saw Clara as she really was, it might trigger some memories. The first photograph hit her like a physical blow. A little girl with pigtails and gap-toothed grin, wearing a yellow sundress and sitting on a tire swing. The girl looked exactly like Eliza had at that age. Or at least, like she imagined she would have looked, based on the few photos Miriam had taken during their early years together. My God, she whispered. That was taken about 6 months before she disappeared, Nathaniel said quietly. She'd just turned 8. The next photo showed the same little girl standing next to a tall man in a business suit. They were in what looked like a garden, and the resemblance between father and daughter was unmistakable, but it was the expression on the child's face that made Eliza's breath catch. Pure, uncomplicated adoration as she looked up at the man beside her. She loved those garden parties, Nathaniel continued, his voice thick with memory. She'd put on her best dress and play hostess, charming all my business associates. Everyone said she was going to be a heartbreaker when she grew up. More photos followed. Clara at a piano recital, Clara building a snowman, Clara blowing out candles on a birthday cake. Each image felt like a piece of a jigsaw puzzle clicking into place, forming a picture of a life Eliza couldn't quite remember, but somehow recognized. The medical records matched too, Nathaniel said, pulling out official-looking documents. Clara broke her arm when she was 6, falling out of that same tire swing. She had her tonsils removed when she was 7. Both incidents left scars. Without thinking, Eliza pulled up her sleeve, revealing a thin white line on her left forearm. She'd always assumed it was from her time on the streets before St. Catherine's, some accident she couldn't remember. Nathaniel's eyes filled with tears. She was so brave when they set the bone. The doctor said most kids would have been screaming, but Clara just held my hand and asked if she could have ice cream afterward. The room felt like it was spinning. Every piece of evidence, every photograph, every document pointed to the same impossible conclusion. She really was Clara Ainsworth. She really had been this man's daughter, living in what looked like a fairy tale life before something terrible happened. What about my mother? She asked suddenly. Clara's mother. Where was she when all this happened? Nathaniel's expression darkened. Sarah died when Clara was 4. Cancer. After that, it was just the 2 of us. He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. And my brother Edgar. He lived with us, helped take care of Clara while I was working. Something cold settled in Eliza's stomach at the mention of the brother. Where is he now? Still living in the family home? He never married, never moved out. I think losing Clara hit him almost as hard as it hit me. Nathaniel's voice carried a note of something Eliza couldn't quite identify. Guilt, maybe, or regret. He's been my only family for 20 years. The waitress approached their table, breaking the heavy moment. Can I get you folks anything else? Just the check, please, Nathaniel said. Then to Eliza, I know this is a lot to process. I don't expect you to make any decisions today. I want to see the house, Eliza said suddenly. If I really lived there, if I was really Clara, then maybe being there would help me remember. Nathaniel's face lit up with hope so bright it was almost painful to look at. Are you sure? No, Eliza said honestly. I'm not sure about anything. But Martha was right. I can spend the rest of my life wondering, or I can find out for sure. When? Tonight. If that's okay. After I get off work. Nathaniel nodded eagerly. I'll pick you up wherever you'd like. As they stood to leave, Eliza caught sight of their reflection in the coffee shop window. Father and daughter, or at least 2 people who looked like they could be related, standing side by side for the first time in 20 years. For just a moment, she could almost imagine what it would feel like to have a family again, to belong somewhere, to someone, in a way she hadn't since Miriam's death. But she'd learned long ago that hope was a dangerous thing. It had a way of setting you up for disappointment just when you started to believe good things might actually be possible. Still, as they walked out into the Nashville afternoon, Eliza found herself looking forward to tonight with an anticipation that felt both thrilling and terrifying. She was going home, maybe for the first time, or maybe for the second. Either way, she was about to find out who Clara Ainsworth had really been. The Ainsworth mansion sat on 5 acres of perfectly manicured lawn in Belle Meade, Nashville's most exclusive neighborhood. As Nathaniel's black BMW wound up the circular drive, Eliza pressed her face to the window, studying the imposing Tudor-style structure that might once have been her home. "It's bigger than I imagined," she said softly. "Clara used to say it was like living in a castle," Nathaniel replied, his voice tinged with bittersweet memory. She'd pretend she was a princess, running up and down the main staircase in her nightgown. Something flickered at the edge of Eliza's consciousness, a flash of polished hardwood beneath bare feet, the echo of laughter in a grand hallway. But when she tried to grasp the memory, it slipped away like smoke. The front door opened before they reached it, revealing a man in his early 50s with thinning hair and nervous eyes. He looked enough like Nathaniel to be family, but where Nathaniel carried himself with the confidence of success, this man seemed diminished somehow, as if life had worn him down to his essential elements. "Edgar," Nathaniel said, "I'd like you to meet Eliza Monroe. I believe she might be Clara." Edgar Ainsworth's face went through a series of expressions so quickly that Eliza almost missed them. Shock, recognition, fear, and finally, something that looked almost like resignation. "My God," Edgar whispered, stepping closer. "The resemblance it's uncanny. More than just resemblance," Nathaniel said firmly. "The medical records match. The scars, the dental work, everything. We're running a DNA test to be absolutely certain, but I'm already sure." Edgar's gaze flicked between his brother and Eliza, and she caught something unsettling in his expression. Not the joy she might have expected from an uncle reuniting with his lost niece, but something darker. Worry, maybe, or calculation. "Well," Edgar said finally, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is certainly unexpected. Please, come in. You must want to see the house." The interior of the mansion was even more impressive than the exterior. A grand staircase curved up from the marble foyer, and oil paintings in heavy frames lined the walls. Everything spoke of old money and established taste, the kind of wealth that whispered rather than shouted. But it was the family portrait above the fireplace that stopped Eliza in her tracks. A younger Nathaniel stood behind a beautiful woman with dark hair and kind eyes, his hands resting on the shoulders of a little girl who could have been Eliza's twin. "That's Sarah," Nathaniel said softly. "Clara's mother, and that's Clara when she was 7. About a year before she disappeared." Eliza stared at the painting, waiting for some surge of recognition, some flood of returning memories. Instead, she felt only a deep sadness for the family that had been torn apart by tragedy. "Would you like to see Clara's room?" Edgar asked, his voice carefully neutral. "It's been preserved exactly as it was." They climbed the grand staircase, passing more family photos and portraits of long-dead Ainsworths. Clara's room was at the end of a long hallway, its door slightly ajar, as if someone had just stepped out and might return at any moment. The room was a little girl's dream. Pink walls decorated with fairy tale murals, a canopy bed draped in white lace, shelves lined with dolls and stuffed animals. But it was the easel in the corner that drew Eliza's attention, still holding a half-finished painting of a garden party. "She was always drawing or painting," Nathaniel said, noticing her focus. "You saw one of her drawings last night. She made dozens of them, always featuring the 2 of us." Eliza approached the easel, studying the unfinished painting. The brush strokes were careful but childish, the perspective slightly off in the way of young artists. But there was something about the scene that felt familiar, not the specific image, but the feeling behind it, the happiness, the sense of belonging. "I should go," Edgar said suddenly from the doorway. "Let you 2 have some privacy. I'll be in my study if you need anything." After Edgar left, Nathaniel sat heavily on the edge of Clara's bed, looking older than his 55 years. "I used to come in here every night after she disappeared," he said quietly. "I'd sit right here and imagine she might walk through that door, asking for a glass of water or complaining about a bad dream. It must have been hell," Eliza said, meaning it. "The not knowing was the worst part. I hired the best private investigators money could buy, but they all came up empty. It was like Clara had simply vanished from the face of the earth." He looked up at her with haunted eyes. "Where were you, Eliza? Where were you all those years? I told you about St. Catherine's, and about Miriam adopting me. But honestly, I don't remember much from before I was 9. The doctors said severe trauma can cause that kind of memory loss. Miriam Lowell, Nathaniel said thoughtfully. Tell me more about her. What did she look like? What was her background? Eliza closed her eyes, conjuring up the image of the woman who had saved her life in every way that mattered. She was in her 40s when she adopted me, with graying brown hair and the kindest eyes I've ever seen. She used to say she'd been called by God to leave the convent and become a mother instead of a sister. A nun who left her vows, Nathaniel repeated slowly. That's unusual. She never talked much about her life before me, said the past was less important than the future we were building together. Eliza's voice caught slightly. She was the best mother anyone could ask for. Patient, loving, always putting my needs before her own. I don't know what would have happened to me without her. Nathaniel stood and moved to Clara's desk, where he picked up a small framed photo. It showed Clara and Edgar building a sandcastle on some beach, both of them laughing at the camera. Edgar was devastated when Clara disappeared. He said, he'd become like a father figure to her after Sarah died. I was working so much in those days, building the business. Edgar was the one who took her to school plays and soccer games, who read her bedtime stories when I was stuck in meetings. Something about the way he said it made Eliza look at him more closely. You feel guilty about that? It wasn't a question, and Nathaniel didn't deny it. I was so focused on building an empire to leave her that I forgot to actually spend time with her while she was there to enjoy it. Edgar stepped in, and Clara adored him for it. Sometimes I wondered if she loved him more than she loved me. Children don't think like that, Eliza said gently. Love isn't a competition to them. Maybe not, but the guilt has eaten at me for 20 years. He set the photo down and turned back to her. I keep thinking that if I'd been a better father, if I'd been paying more attention that night, she never would have been taken. What happened that night, exactly? I mean, Nathaniel's face darkened with the memory. I was hosting a business party downstairs. Big deal I'd been working on for months. Lots of important people. Clara had been allowed to stay up late and mingle with the guests. She loved playing hostess. Around 9 o'clock, I sent her upstairs to get ready for bed. When I went to check on her an hour later, she was gone. Her window was open, and there were signs of a struggle. No witnesses. None. The party was loud. Lots of people coming and going. Someone could have taken her right out the front door and nobody would have noticed. His hands clenched into fists. The police said it was probably someone who knew the house, knew our routines, someone who'd been watching us. A chill ran down Eliza's spine. The idea of being watched, hunted, by someone close enough to know intimate details of their lives was terrifying. Did they ever have any suspects? A few. Some of my business associates had questionable backgrounds. There was a disgruntled former employee who'd been fired a few months earlier, but none of the leads panned out. Nathaniel's voice grew bitter. Eventually, the case went cold. Another missing child who became just another statistic. They spent the next hour going through Clara's things. Her diary with its innocent entries about school friends and favorite TV shows. Her collection of horse figurines. Her closet full of dresses that would never be worn again. With each item, Eliza waited for the spark of recognition that might unlock her buried memories. But nothing came. It was only when they were leaving that something finally clicked as they passed the kitchen. Eliza caught a whiff of vanilla and cinnamon. Someone had been baking cookies. The scent hit her like a physical force, and suddenly, she was somewhere else. Someone else. A woman with kind eyes and flour-dusted hands, pulling chocolate chip cookies from an oven. Just one before dinner, Clara. Don't tell your father. Giggling as she snuck a warm cookie, the chocolate still melting on her tongue. Eliza. Nathaniel's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you all right? She blinked, finding herself gripping the doorframe for support. I think I just remembered something. Someone baking cookies. A woman, but not my mother. Someone else. Edgar bakes, Nathaniel said slowly. He's always been good in the kitchen. Clara used to help him make cookies for her school functions. But even as he said it, Eliza knew that wasn't quite right. The woman in her flash of memory had been someone else entirely. Someone with weathered hands and a face lined by years of worry and love. Someone who might have been named Miriam, or might have been someone else entirely. As they drove back toward Eliza's apartment, she found herself studying Nathaniel's profile in the dim light from the dashboard. He was a good man. She was sure of that. A man who'd spent 20 years grieving for his lost daughter and never stopped hoping she might come home. But there were still too many pieces missing. Too many gaps in the story that didn't quite make sense. Why had she ended up at St. Catherine specifically? How had Miriam, a supposed nun, been able to adopt her so quickly? And why did Edgar seem so nervous about her return? Tomorrow, she decided, she would start digging deeper into Miriam's past. If she really was Clara Ainsworth, then understanding how she'd become Eliza Monroe was the key to everything else. The answers were out there somewhere. She just had to be brave enough to find them. The next morning, Nathaniel made a phone call that would change everything. Lawrence Pike answered on the second ring, his gravelly voice carrying the weariness of a man who'd seen too much of humanity's dark side. Pike Investigations. Lawrence, it's Nathaniel Ainsworth. I need you to drop everything you're working on. There was a pause. Pike had worked for Nathaniel before, tracking down leads in Clara's disappearance that had ultimately led nowhere. Found another lead on your daughter? I found my daughter. The silence on the other end stretched long enough that Nathaniel wondered if the connection had been lost. Finally, Pike spoke, his voice carefully controlled. You sure about this, Nathaniel? Because we've been down this road before. This time is different. Her name is Eliza Monroe, and she has the drawing. She has Clara's scars, her face, everything. I need you to dig into her past. Specifically, I need to know everything about a woman named Miriam Lowell, who supposedly adopted her from St. Catherine's Children's Home. How far back do you want me to go? All the way. If Eliza really is Clara, then someone took her from my house 20 years ago and somehow got her into that orphanage. I want to know who, and I want to know why. Pike was quiet for another moment. This is going to stir up a lot of old ghosts, Nathaniel. You prepared for that. I've been living with ghosts for 20 years. It's time to put them to rest. Meanwhile, Edgar Ainsworth sat in his study, staring at a glass of bourbon he'd poured an hour ago but hadn't touched. His hands were shaking, had been shaking since the moment he'd seen Eliza Monroe standing in their foyer, looking exactly like Clara had at 28. He'd always known this day might come, had nightmares about it actually, but as the years passed and no trace of Clara ever surfaced, he'd begun to believe his secret was safe, that the choices he'd made in a moment of desperate jealousy would stay buried forever. Now she was back, and everything was falling apart. Edgar reached for his phone with trembling fingers, dialing a number he'd hoped never to use again. It's me, he said when the call connected. We have a problem. 3 days later, Pike called Nathaniel with news that sent ice through his veins. Miriam Lowell never existed, Pike said without preamble. At least, not in the way your Eliza remembers her. The woman who adopted Eliza Monroe from St. Catherine's was actually named Sylvia Harrington. And get this, she used to work for you. Nathaniel nearly dropped the phone. What? Sylvia Harrington, age 42 at the time of the adoption. She was employed as a housekeeper at your estate from 1998 to 2004. Left abruptly in October 2004, right around the time Clara disappeared. No forwarding address, no references requested, just vanished. The pieces began clicking together in Nathaniel's mind, forming a picture so impossible he could barely comprehend it. You're saying my housekeeper kidnapped Clara. I'm saying your housekeeper disappeared the same night as your daughter, then reappeared a year later in Memphis with a new identity and a traumatized little girl she claimed to have adopted. Pike's voice was grim. There's more, Nathaniel. Sylvia Harrington died 5 years ago under the name Miriam Lowell. Cancer, just like Eliza said. But here's the kicker. She left behind a safety deposit box. What was in it? I don't know yet. Bank won't open it without a court order, but I think we both know what we're going to find. Nathaniel closed his eyes, his mind reeling. Sylvia Harrington. He remembered her now. A quiet, efficient woman who'd worked for them for 6 years. She'd been particularly good with Clara, always patient and kind. Clara had liked her, trusted her, which made what she'd done so much worse. There's something else, Pike continued. I've been digging into the timeline, and something doesn't add up. If Sylvia kidnapped Clara, why wait a full year before surfacing in Memphis? Where was Clara during that missing year? That night, Nathaniel couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Sylvia Harrington. trying to remember anything unusual about her behavior in the weeks before Clara's disappearance. She'd been nervous about something, he recalled now. Jumpy. He'd assumed it was personal problems. Maybe money troubles or a difficult boyfriend. He'd never imagined she was planning to steal his daughter. But why? What could possibly motivate a woman who'd seemed to genuinely care for Clara to do something so monstrous? The answer came to him in a flash of memory so vivid it made him sit up in bed. The business party. The night Clara disappeared. He could see it all now with crystal clarity. Details his grief-stricken mind had suppressed for 20 years. October 15th, 2004. The Ainsworth mansion was filled with Nashville's business elite, all gathered to celebrate the Patterson development deal that would make Nathaniel one of the wealthiest men in Tennessee. Clara had been the belle of the ball in her blue velvet dress, charming everyone with her precocious observations about adult conversation. Around 8:30, Nathaniel had noticed Edgar deep in conversation with two men he didn't recognize. Rough-looking men who didn't fit with the usual crowd of bankers and developers. When he'd approached to introduce himself, Edgar had quickly dismissed the strangers, claiming they were just caterers. At 9 o'clock, Nathaniel had sent Clara upstairs to get ready for bed. She'd been tired, rubbing her eyes and yawning, but she'd complained about missing the rest of the party. "Just a few more minutes, Daddy," she'd pleaded, but he'd been firm. "Bedtime, princess. You can say goodnight to Uncle Edgar, then straight upstairs." He remembered watching her hug Edgar goodnight, remembered the strange look on his brother's face as he'd held her just a little too long. At the time, he'd thought Edgar was just being sentimental. Now, he wondered if it had been something else entirely. An hour later, when Nathaniel went upstairs to check on Clara, she was gone. Her bedroom window was open, the screen cut cleanly from the outside, but there had been no ladder marks in the soft earth below, no footprints, no signs of forced entry anywhere else in the house. It was Edgar who'd called the police. Edgar who'd organized the search parties. Edgar who'd held Nathaniel while he sobbed over his missing daughter. Edgar, who'd inherited everything when Clara was declared legally dead 7 years later. The memory hit Nathaniel like a physical blow. How had he never connected these dots before? How had he never questioned the convenient timing, the lack of real evidence, the way Edgar had always seemed more resigned than grief-stricken about Clara's disappearance? Because he'd trusted his brother, because the alternative was too horrible to contemplate. But now, with Sylvia Harrington's true identity revealed, the pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Edgar hadn't just failed to protect Clara that night, he'd orchestrated her disappearance. And somehow, Sylvia Harrington had discovered his plan. Nathaniel reached for his phone, hands shaking with rage and betrayal. Pike answered on the first ring. "I need that safety deposit box opened," Nathaniel said without preamble. "Tonight, if possible." "Nathaniel, it's 3 in the morning. The banks aren't... I don't care what it costs or who you have to wake up. I think my brother was involved in Clara's disappearance, and I think Sylvia Harrington knew about it. Whatever she left in that box might be the proof we need." Pike was quiet for a long moment. "You sure you want to go down this road? Once we open that box, there's no going back. My brother betrayed me and destroyed my family for money. My daughter spent 20 years thinking she was an orphan because of his greed." Nathaniel's voice was steel. "There's already no going back." 6 hours later, they stood in the vault of First National Bank, staring at the contents of safety deposit box 1247. Inside were documents, photographs, and audio recordings that painted a picture of betrayal so complete it took Nathaniel's breath away. The photos showed Edgar meeting with the same rough men from the party, handing over envelopes of cash. The documents detailed payments totaling $50,000, with Clara's abduction date circled in red on a calendar, and the audio recordings, secretly made by Sylvia Harrington from her position in the kitchen, captured Edgar planning every detail of his niece's disappearance. "The kid goes missing during the party," Edgar's voice crackled from an old cassette player. "Lots of confusion, lots of people. By the time anyone notices she's gone, you'll be long gone with her." "What about the housekeeper?" asked an unfamiliar voice. "She's always hovering around the kid. Don't worry about Sylvia. She minds her own business, sees nothing, hears nothing." But Sylvia had seen everything, and when she'd realized Edgar planned to have Clara killed after the kidnapping was complete, she'd done the only thing she could think of. She'd saved the little girl herself. The final item in the box was a letter addressed to Clara, written in Sylvia's careful handwriting. My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, then you've discovered the truth about who you really are. I'm sorry for the lies, sorry for the pain, sorry for taking you away from your father who loves you so much. But I couldn't let Edgar's men kill you, and I couldn't prove what I knew without putting us both in danger. I've loved you like my own daughter for 20 years. You gave my life meaning when I thought it had none, but you belong with your real father. In the world Edgar stole from you. The proof is all here. Edgar Ainsworth orchestrated your kidnapping because he was jealous of your father's success and your place in the family will. He hired men to take you, planning to make it look like a random abduction. When the trail went cold, he would inherit everything. I rescued you from those men, but I could never take you home because Edgar would have tried again. So I gave us both new identities and built a life where you could be safe. I hope someday you can forgive me for the life I stole from you. But I pray you understand that I saved the only life that mattered. Yours. With all my love, Miriam, Sylvia. Nathaniel read the letter 3 times before the words truly sank in. 20 years of grief, 20 years of wondering, 20 years of living with a brother who'd orchestrated the destruction of his family. What do you want to do? Pike asked quietly. Nathaniel looked at the evidence spread before them. Enough to send Edgar to prison for the rest of his life. Enough to prove that Clara was alive and had been living under their noses all along. I want my daughter to know the truth, he said finally. All of it. Then I want Edgar to pay for what he did to our family. But first, he had to call Eliza. He had to tell her that Miriam hadn't been a saint after all. She'd been something far more complex. A woman who'd committed a crime in service of a greater good, who'd sacrificed everything to save a child she barely knew. A woman who'd been more of a mother to Clara than Edgar had ever been an uncle. The DNA results came back on a Tuesday that started like any other. Eliza was refilling salt shakers at the Lantern when her phone buzzed with a text from Nathaniel. Can you meet me at the coffee shop? I have news. Something in the brevity of the message made her stomach clench. Good news usually came with more words, more enthusiasm. Bad news arrived in short, careful sentences that tried not to reveal too much. 20 minutes later, she slid into the same corner booth where they'd first shared evidence of her possible past. Nathaniel was already there, looking like he'd aged a decade since she'd seen him 3 days ago. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his usually perfect hair was disheveled, as if he'd been running his hands through it. The DNA results, she said without preamble. That's why you called. 99.7% match, he said quietly. You're Clara Ainsworth. Officially, legally, scientifically, there's no doubt anymore. The words should have brought relief, closure, the satisfaction of finally knowing who she really was. Instead, Eliza felt hollow, like someone had scooped out her insides and left only the shell behind. Eliza, Nathaniel reached across the table, covering her hand with his. Are you all right? I don't know, she said honestly. I thought I wanted to know for sure, but now that I do, I don't know how to be Clara Ainsworth. I've been Eliza Monroe for 20 years. That's the only person I know how to be. You don't have to stop being Eliza, Nathaniel said gently. You can be both. Clara was who you were, but Eliza is who you've become. There's room for both in your life. Eliza nodded, though the concept still felt impossibly complex. What about Miriam? Have you found out anything about how I ended up with her? Nathaniel's expression darkened, and that hollow feeling in Eliza's chest grew deeper. That's the other reason I called Lawrence, my private investigator. Uncovered some things about your adoption. About Miriam herself. What kind of things? Her real name was Sylvia Harrington. She worked as a housekeeper in our house for 6 years, right up until the night you disappeared. The coffee shop around them seemed to fade away as the implications hit her. You're saying she kidnapped me? It's more complicated than that. Nathaniel pulled out a manila folder, much thicker than the one from their first meeting. Sylvia left evidence behind. Lots of evidence. She was protecting you, Eliza, from someone who wanted to hurt you. Who? Nathaniel's face crumpled with pain and betrayal. My brother Edgar. The folder contained photocopies of documents, transcripts of audio recordings, and photographs that painted a picture so twisted Eliza could barely process it. Her own uncle, a man she couldn't even remember, had orchestrated her kidnapping for money, had hired criminals to take her, planning to have her killed once the inheritance was secured. Sylvia overheard Edgar making the arrangements, Nathaniel explained, his voice hollow with grief. She couldn't go to the police without proof, and she couldn't prove it without putting both of you in danger. So she saved you the only way she knew how. She took you herself. Eliza stared at a photograph of Edgar handing an envelope to a man with dead eyes and crude tattoos. She committed a crime to save me from a worse crime. She spent a year hiding with you, waiting for the heat to die down. Then she created new identities for both of you and started over in Memphis. She gave up her entire life to keep you safe. And I never knew. Eliza's voice was barely a whisper. All those years, I thought she was just a nun who wanted to be a mother. I never knew she was a hero. She was more than that, Nathaniel said. She was a mother in every way that mattered. She loved you, raised you, protected you from a truth that would have destroyed your childhood, even when she was dying. She left evidence behind so that someday you could come home safely. Tears she'd been holding back for days finally spilled over, not just for herself, or for Nathaniel, or even for the childhood that had been stolen from her, but for Miriam, Sylvia, who'd sacrificed everything for a little girl she barely knew, and who'd never asked for recognition or gratitude in return. Does Edgar know that I'm back? He's suspected since the night you came to the house. He's been nervous, evasive. Now I understand why. Nathaniel's jaw tightened. 20 years, Eliza. 20 years I lived with my brother. Let him console me over losing you. Let him help me grieve. He held me when I cried over your empty bedroom, and the whole time, he was the reason you were gone. What are you going to do? Turn the evidence over to the police? Edgar's going to pay for what he did to our family. Eliza nodded, but something else was bothering her. The men he hired, the ones who were supposed to kill me, what happened to them? Sylvia's notes suggest they were never paid their final installment. Edgar told them the job was off, that you'd been found and returned safely. They probably assumed you'd been rescued by police and went on to other work. But what if they find out the truth? What if they realize Edgar never intended to pay them because I'm still alive? Nathaniel's face went pale. Lawrence is looking into that. We're taking precautions. But even as he said it, Eliza could see the worry in his eyes. 20-year-old crimes had a way of creating 20-year-old enemies. And men who killed children for money weren't likely to forgive being cheated out of their payment. That night, Eliza lay in her small apartment, staring at copies of documents that proved her entire life had been built on lies and sacrifice. Miriam hadn't been a nun called by God to motherhood. She'd been a housekeeper called by conscience to heroism. The strangest part was that it changed nothing about how Eliza felt about her adoptive mother. If anything, knowing the truth made her love Miriam more. She hadn't saved Clara Ainsworth because it was easy or convenient or profitable. She'd done it because it was right, even knowing it would cost her everything. Around midnight, the memories started coming back. Not all at once, not in any coherent order, but in flashes and fragments that hit her like physical blows. The sensation of being carried by strong arms that smelled like vanilla and laundry soap. A woman's voice whispering, "It's all right, sweetheart. You're safe now. I won't let anyone hurt you." Hiding in a small apartment that smelled like cigarettes and fear. Not understanding why they couldn't go home. Why the nice lady who used to clean their house was now taking care of her. Nightmares about men with cruel faces and rough hands, and Miriam holding her until the terrors passed. The gradual realization that her real name wasn't Clara anymore. That the woman caring for her wasn't really named Miriam. That everything about their old lives had to disappear for them to survive. "We're going to have new names," Miriam had explained gently. "New birthdays, new stories. It's like being characters in a play. Sweetheart, can you pretend to be someone new for me?" 8-year-old Clara had nodded solemnly, not fully understanding, but trusting the woman who'd saved her. She'd practiced writing Eliza Monroe, until the letters felt natural under her small fingers. She'd learned to answer to her new name, to recite her new birthday, to tell people her new story about being an orphan who'd been adopted by a kind ex-nun. By the time they settled in Nashville, the pretense had become reality. Clara Ainsworth existed only in nightmares and half-remembered dreams. Eliza Monroe was the girl who loved to read, who helped Miriam in the kitchen, who never asked too many questions about the past because she understood. Instinctively, that some truths were too dangerous to speak aloud. Now, at 28, those buried memories were fighting their way to the surface, bringing with them a complex mixture of grief and gratitude. She grieved for the childhood that had been stolen, for the father who'd spent 20 years thinking she was dead, for the innocence that had been shattered by adult greed and betrayal. But she was grateful too. Grateful for Miriam's courage, for the sacrifices that had kept her safe, for the love that had shaped her into the woman she'd become. Eliza Monroe might have been born from tragedy, but she'd been raised with devotion. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. Nathaniel's name appeared on the screen. "I'm sorry to call so late," he said. "I just wanted to make sure you were all right. I know today was overwhelming." "I'm processing," she said honestly. "It's a lot to take in. The memories are coming back, aren't they?" Lawrence said that often happens when trauma victims feel safe enough to remember. Some of them, fragments, mostly, but enough to understand what Sylvia did for me. Eliza paused. "I want to see Edgar." "Absolutely not." Nathaniel's response was immediate and firm. "It's too dangerous. If he realizes how much we know." "He's my uncle," Eliza said quietly. "And regardless of what he did, I need to look him in the eye and understand why. I need to hear him explain how he could plan to murder an 8-year-old girl for money. Eliza, please, let the police handle this. The police will arrest him based on 20-year-old evidence. But I'll never get answers to the questions that matter. Why did he hate me so much? What did I ever do to him? How could he live with himself all these years, knowing what he'd done?" Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. "If you're determined to do this, I'll be there with you. We'll confront him together, but we do it safely, with Lawrence present, and we don't give Edgar any warning. Tomorrow. After they hung up, Eliza sat in the darkness of her apartment, thinking about the little girl who'd once lived in a mansion and drawn pictures of herself with her father. That child had been loved and protected and happy, right up until the moment her own family betrayed her. But she'd also been saved by someone who barely knew her, someone who'd thrown away her entire life to keep a stranger's daughter safe in losing Clara Ainsworth. She'd gained something perhaps more valuable, the knowledge that love didn't always come from blood, and that heroism sometimes wore the face of an ordinary housekeeper who refused to let evil win. Tomorrow she would face the man who'd tried to have her killed. Tonight, she would remember the woman who'd made sure he failed. They never made it to Edgar. At 2:47 a.m., 3 men in dark clothes kicked in the door of Eliza's apartment. She woke to the sound of splintering wood and had exactly enough time to register that her worst nightmare was coming true before a gloved hand clamped over her mouth. "Found you, little princess," growled a voice that belonged in her deepest, darkest memories. "Time to finish what we started 20 years ago." Eliza bit down hard on the hand covering her mouth, tasting blood, and earning herself a vicious backhand that sent stars exploding across her vision. Through the haze of pain, she could make out 3 figures. One massive man built like a linebacker, another lean and wiry with prison tattoos crawling up his neck, and a third who seemed to be calling the shots. "Easy, Tony," said the leader, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite and left out to weather. "Edgar wants her alive long enough to sign some papers. Then we finish the job we were hired for." Edgar, even through her terror, Eliza felt a cold fury settle in her chest. Her uncle wasn't content to let the police handle his exposure. He was eliminating the evidence. Permanently. "Move," the wiry man hissed, hauling her to her feet. "And don't even think about screaming. This whole building's full of people who mind their own business." They were right. Her neighbors were mostly shift workers and struggling students who'd learned long ago that getting involved in other people's problems was a luxury they couldn't afford. She was on her own. They dragged her down the back stairs and shoved her into a black SUV with tinted windows. As they pulled away from her building, Eliza's mind raced through possibilities. These were the same men Edgar had hired 20 years ago. She was sure of it now. The voice that had called her little princess was from her nightmares, the voice that had haunted her for 2 decades even when she couldn't remember why. "Where are we going?" she asked, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded. "Family reunion," the leader said without turning around. "Your uncle's been real anxious to see you again." The drive took 40 minutes, winding through Nashville's outskirts to an industrial area near the Cumberland River. They pulled up to a warehouse that looked like it had been abandoned since the 1980s. Its windows boarded up and parking lot cracked with weeds. Inside, the warehouse was a maze of rusted machinery and empty crates that created deep shadows in the dim light from a few scattered bulbs. Edgar stood in the center of it all, looking older and smaller than Eliza remembered, but his eyes held a desperate gleam that made her blood run cold. "Clara," he said softly, almost tenderly, "you look so much like your mother." "Don't." The word came out sharp and angry. "You don't get to talk about my mother. You don't get to pretend you cared about me when you tried to have me murdered." Edgar's face twisted with something that might have been pain or might have been regret. "You don't understand. You never understood what it was like, living in your father's shadow my whole life, watching him get everything while I got the scraps. So you decided to kill a child for money. I never wanted you dead." The words exploded out of him. "The plan was simple. Take you for a few days, let Nathaniel sweat, then return you safely once he agreed to split the inheritance more fairly. But then, that interfering housekeeper ruined everything. Sylvia saved my life. Sylvia stole my leverage." Edgar's composure cracked completely. "Do you have any idea what these 20 years have been like? Knowing you were out there somewhere. Knowing that any day you might come back and destroy everything I'd built. I couldn't sleep. Couldn't think. Couldn't move forward with my life because of you." Eliza stared at him, seeing clearly for the first time the weak, bitter man who'd let jealousy consume him entirely. "So you hired them to find me. I hired them to clean up loose ends," Edgar said quietly. "You and that detective who's been digging into things better left buried." The bottom dropped out of Eliza's stomach. "Lawrence, what did you do to Lawrence?" Edgar's smile was cold as winter. "Mr. Pike won't be sharing any more of his discoveries. He had an unfortunate encounter with these gentlemen yesterday evening." "You bastard," Eliza whispered, fury and grief warring in her chest. Lawrence Pike had died trying to help her find the truth about her past, and now she was about to follow him into the dark. "Nothing personal, Princess," said Tony, the massive man who'd grabbed her in the apartment. "Just business that's 20 years overdue." That's when the warehouse lights went out. In the sudden darkness, chaos erupted. Men shouted. Footsteps pounded on concrete, and Eliza heard the distinctive crack of a gun firing. She dropped to the floor behind a stack of crates, her heart hammering so hard she was sure everyone could hear it. "This is the police. The building is surrounded." The voice came from multiple directions at once, amplified by megaphones and echoing off the warehouse walls. More gunshots followed, and Edgar's voice rose above the mayhem, high and panicked. "Kill her. Kill her now before—" His words were cut off by a sound that might have been a struggle, or might have been something worse. Emergency lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows that danced and shifted with each new sound of conflict. Eliza crept deeper into the maze of machinery, trying to put distance between herself and the violence erupting around her. She could hear Edgar somewhere in the darkness, still shouting orders, but his voice was getting fainter. The hired killers were moving through the warehouse like hunters, and she was their prey. "Clara." The voice that called her name wasn't Edgar's. It was Nathaniel's, filled with desperation and fear. "Clara, where are you?" She wanted to answer, wanted to run toward the sound of safety, but something held her back. How had Nathaniel known where to find her? How had he known to bring police unless— "She's over here?" Tony's voice, closer than she'd expected. "Little bitch is hiding behind the—" The sentence ended in a wet gurgle, followed by the sound of a body hitting the concrete. In the shifting emergency light, Eliza caught a glimpse of a figure moving with deadly precision through the shadows. Not police. The movements were too smooth, too practiced. Lawrence Pike stepped into the dim light, blood streaming from a head wound but very much alive. "Stay down," he whispered as he passed her hiding place. "This isn't over yet." Pike moved like a man with nothing left to lose, and Eliza realized that Edgar had made a crucial mistake. He'd assumed the detective was dead, but Pike had survived whatever attempt had been made on his life. More importantly, he'd followed the killers here. The firefight continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. When the shooting finally stopped, the silence was almost worse than the chaos had been. Eliza counted 3 bodies on the warehouse floor. None of them. Edgar. "Clara," Nathaniel's voice again, closer now. "Please, if you can hear me. Here." she called out, finally trusting that it was safe. "I'm here." Nathaniel appeared around a stack of crates, his expensive suit torn and dirty, his face streaked with something that might have been tears, or might have been sweat. He pulled her into his arms so tightly she could barely breathe. "Thank God," he whispered into her hair. "When I got Pike's call, when he told me Edgar's men had taken you, I thought I'd lost you again. How did you find me?" "Pike put a tracker on Edgar's car yesterday, just in case. When Edgar left the house tonight, we followed." Nathaniel pulled back to look at her, his hands shaking as they framed her face. "Are you hurt?" "I'm okay, but Lawrence is tougher than he looks," Pike said, appearing beside them with a makeshift bandage wrapped around his head. "Takes more than a tire iron to the skull to keep me down." "Edgar," Eliza said suddenly, looking around the warehouse. "Where is he?" Pike's expression darkened. "Gone, slipped out during the shooting. But he won't get far. Every cop in Tennessee is looking for him now," as if summoned by his words. The sound of sirens filled the air. Real police this time. Not the fake announcement that had started the firefight. Within minutes, the warehouse was swarming with officers, paramedics, and crime scene investigators. Detective Sarah Morrison, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and graying hair, took Eliza's statement while paramedics checked her for injuries. "Mr. Ainsworth filled us in on the situation," Morrison said. "We've got APBs out on Edgar, and teams searching his known associates. He's not going to get away with this." "What about the men he hired? The ones who—" Eliza gestured toward the bodies being photographed by forensics. "2 dead, 1 in custody. The survivor is already talking, trying to cut a deal. Apparently Edgar promised them a bonus if they eliminated both you and Mr. Pike before the police could arrest him." Eliza leaned against Nathaniel, exhaustion finally catching up with her. 3 days ago, she'd been a waitress with no past and no family. Now she had a father, a fortune, and enemies who wanted her dead. The only constant in her life had been Miriam's love, and even that had been built on lies meant to protect her. "What happens now?" she asked. Detective Morrison looked up from her notepad. "Now we catch Edgar Ainsworth and make sure he spends the rest of his life in prison. And you," she smiled for the first time since arriving, "you get to go home. Home." The word felt strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. She was Clara Ainsworth, daughter of wealth and privilege, heir to a fortune she'd never wanted, but she was also Eliza Monroe, raised by a woman who'd loved her enough to sacrifice everything. Maybe, she thought as Nathaniel helped her toward the warehouse exit, she could find a way to be both. But first they had to find Edgar before he found them. Edgar Ainsworth's face stared back at them from every television screen in Nashville. By dawn, his photo was plastered across news websites, social media, and wanted posters throughout Tennessee. The manhunt for a man who'd orchestrated his own niece's kidnapping had captured the city's attention like nothing in recent memory. But Edgar had vanished as completely as Clara had 20 years earlier. "He's got resources," Detective Morrison explained to Nathaniel and Eliza as they sat in a secure conference room at police headquarters. "Offshore accounts, connections we're still trying to trace. Men like your brother don't stay on top without having escape plans." Eliza wrapped her hands around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. She'd been awake for 36 hours straight, and exhaustion made everything feel surreal, like she was watching someone else's life unfold on a movie screen. "The surviving gunman," she said. "What did he tell you?" Morrison consulted her notes. "Vincent Kowalski, career criminal with a rap sheet going back to the 80s. He confirms Edgar hired him and his associates in 2004 to abduct you, with instructions to kill you after your father paid a ransom. Says Edgar got cold feet at the last minute and called off the murder, telling them you'd been recovered safely. But Sylvia had already taken me," Eliza said quietly. "Right. So Edgar let Kowalski and his crew think the job was done. Never paid them their final installment. They've been looking for Edgar ever since. Wanting their money," Nathaniel looked up sharply. "That's why they found her so easily. They've been tracking Edgar's movements for 20 years, waiting for their chance at payback. Gets worse," Morrison continued. "Kowalski says Edgar contacted them 3 weeks ago with a new offer. $50,000 to eliminate both Clara and Lawrence Pike. Apparently, your brother knew his past was catching up with him. The irony wasn't lost on any of them. Edgar's attempt to cover up his crimes had led directly to their exposure. If he'd simply let the past stay buried, Eliza might never have learned the truth about her identity. What about Lawrence's evidence? Nathaniel asked. The documents Sylvia left behind. That's where things get complicated, Morrison said, her expression grim. The safety deposit box evidence is compelling, but it's 20 years old. Edgar's lawyers are already claiming the audio recordings were fabricated, that Sylvia Harrington was mentally unstable, that this is all an elaborate fraud designed to get you access to the Ainsworth fortune. Eliza felt something cold settle in her stomach. You're saying it might not be enough? I'm saying Edgar's smart and well-connected. He'll fight this with everything he's got, and 20-year-old evidence has a way of getting complicated in court. Pike shifted in his chair, wincing as the movement pulled at his bandaged head. What about the attack last night? That's fresh evidence. Kowalski's testimony helps, but he's a career criminal trying to save his own skin. A good defense attorney will tear him apart on cross-examination. Morrison leaned forward. What we need is something current. Something that proves Edgar's guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. Like what? Like Edgar himself admitting to the crime. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Morrison was suggesting they use Eliza as bait, drawing Edgar out of hiding for a confrontation that could be recorded and used as evidence. Absolutely not, Nathaniel said immediately. I won't risk her life again. With respect, Mr. Ainsworth, your daughter is the only person Edgar wants badly enough to take that risk. He's already proven he'll kill to keep his secret safe. Eliza found herself speaking before she'd consciously decided to. What did you have in mind? Eliza, no, Nathaniel said firmly. We've already lost 20 years. I won't lose you again. And I won't spend the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, wondering when Edgar's going to make his next move. She looked directly at Morrison. What's the plan? Morrison pulled out a file folder thick with documents and photographs. Edgar's been staying one step ahead of us, but he's made mistakes. Credit card charges at gas stations, security cameras at a motel in Clarksville. He's moving in a pattern, circling back toward Nashville. Why would he come back here? Because he's desperate. His accounts are frozen. His associates are being arrested, and every law enforcement agency in the region is looking for him. But more than that, Morrison paused, choosing her words carefully. Our psychological profile suggests Edgar can't let this go. You represent everything that went wrong in his life. Every opportunity he feels was stolen from him. He won't be able to resist one final confrontation. Pike leaned forward, interested despite his injuries. You want to give him that confrontation on our terms. Exactly. We set up a meeting somewhere we can control the environment, record everything he says, and have backup ready the moment things go wrong. Nathaniel stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over downtown Nashville. It's too dangerous. Edgar's already tried to have her killed twice. What makes you think he won't just shoot her on sight? Because he needs her alive long enough to sign documents transferring the inheritance to him, Morrison said. Kowalski confirmed that was part of Edgar's plan. Kill her after she signs away her rights to the family fortune. But I've never signed anything, Eliza protested. I didn't even know I was Clara Ainsworth until a week ago. Edgar doesn't know that. From his perspective, you've been back for days, meeting with lawyers, potentially changing wills and transferring assets. He's probably terrified that you've already cut him out completely. The plan Morrison outlined was elegant in its simplicity. They would leak information suggesting that Eliza was meeting with estate lawyers at a neutral location, an abandoned restaurant on the outskirts of Nashville that police could easily surround and monitor. When Edgar arrived to stop the meeting, they would be ready. He'll be armed, Pike warned. Desperate and armed is a dangerous combination. So will we, Morrison replied. Plus body armor, surveillance equipment, and backup teams positioned throughout the area. The moment Edgar admits to orchestrating Clara's kidnapping, we move in. Eliza studied the photographs of the proposed meeting site. It was perfect for their purposes, isolated enough that Edgar would feel safe approaching, but with clear sight lines for police snipers and multiple escape routes blocked by positioning officers strategically. When? She asked. Tonight. The longer we wait, the more time Edgar has to get desperate enough to do something truly stupid. Nathaniel returned to the table, his face etched with worry. I don't like this. There are too many variables. Too many things that could go wrong. Dad, Eliza said softly. the word feeling strange but right on her tongue. It was the first time she'd called him that, and she saw his eyes fill with tears. This is the only way to end it. Edgar's not going to stop until one of us is dead. At least this way. We get to choose the battlefield. Clara. Eliza, she corrected gently. I know you want your little girl back, but that 8-year-old is gone. I'm not her anymore, and I can't pretend to be, but I can be your daughter in a different way, if you'll let me. Nathaniel sat down heavily, looking older than his 55 years. I've already lost you once. I don't think I could survive losing you again. You won't, Eliza said with more confidence than she felt. We're going to end this tonight, and then we're going to figure out how to be a family again. Morrison spread out detailed floor plans of the restaurant, pointing out entry points and defensive positions. Edgar will probably bring backup. Maybe more hired guns, maybe just weapons. We'll be ready for either. What about afterward? Pike asked. Assuming this works, what happens to the Ainsworth fortune? It was a question Eliza had been avoiding, but she couldn't ignore it forever. As Clara Ainsworth, she was heir to millions of dollars, multiple properties and business interests she didn't understand. As Eliza Monroe, she was a waitress who struggled to pay rent on a studio apartment. I don't want it, she said quietly. The money, I mean. It's built on 20 years of grief and guilt. I can't take comfort from something that caused so much pain. Clara, Nathaniel said gently, it's your inheritance, your mother's jewelry, your college fund, money that was always meant to be yours. Maybe. But Eliza Monroe was raised to work for what she has. I think I'd rather keep doing that. She saw understanding dawn in her father's eyes. This wasn't about rejecting her heritage or punishing him for the past. It was about being true to the woman Miriam had raised her to become, someone who found value in honest work and simple living, not inherited wealth. We'll figure it out, Nathaniel said. After tonight, we'll have time to work through all of this. Morrison checked her watch. Speaking of tonight, we need to get moving. The setup takes time, and Edgar's pattern suggests he'll be back in the Nashville area by evening. As they prepared to leave the police station, Eliza felt the weight of 20 years pressing down on her shoulders. Tonight would determine not just Edgar's fate, but her own. Would she be Clara Ainsworth, reclaiming her birthright? Would she remain Eliza Monroe, the woman Miriam had shaped with love and sacrifice? Or could she somehow find a way to honor both identities? The answer, she suspected, lay waiting in an abandoned restaurant where past and present would finally collide. One way or another, this would be the night she discovered who she really was. The abandoned restaurant sat like a ghost from another era on the edge of Briley Parkway, its windows boarded up and parking lot cracked with 20 years of neglect. Mama's Kitchen had been a Nashville institution once, the kind of place where truckers and traveling salesmen could count on good coffee and honest food. Now it was just another casualty of changing times and interstate bypass roads. Perfect for a trap. Eliza adjusted the wire taped to her chest, the tiny microphone feeling like a lead weight against her skin. Detective Morrison's voice crackled through the nearly invisible earpiece. Test. How's the audio, Clara? Loud and clear, Eliza whispered back, using the name Morrison insisted on for operational security. And it's Eliza. Copy that. Remember? Keep him talking as long as possible. We need a full confession on tape. Through the restaurant's dusty windows, Eliza could see police snipers positioned on the roof of an auto parts store across the street. More officers were hidden in abandoned buildings throughout the area, all waiting for Edgar to make his move. The setup had taken 3 hours, and now all they could do was wait. Nathaniel's voice came through the earpiece next. Are you sure about this? We could still call it off. I'm sure, Eliza said, though her hands were shaking. It's time to end this. She'd been sitting in the empty restaurant for 20 minutes when she heard the first car pull into the parking lot. Through a gap in the boarded windows, she could see Edgar stepping out of a stolen Honda, looking around nervously before approaching the building. He looked terrible. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained. But his eyes held the desperate gleam of a man with nothing left to lose. The restaurant's back door creaked open, and Edgar stepped inside, a pistol held loosely in his right hand. Hello, Clara, he said softly. You look just like your mother when she was your age. I told you not to talk about my mother, Eliza replied. fighting to keep her voice steady. Sarah was beautiful, but she was weak and naive, just like your father. They both thought the world was full of good people who would do the right thing if you just gave them enough chances. Edgar moved closer, the gun never wavering. I learned early that the world doesn't work that way. So you decided to take what you thought you deserved. Edgar laughed, but there was no humor in it. Deserved. I worked twice as hard as Nathaniel, but he got all the credit because he was 2 years older. I built half that company with my own hands, but everyone called it Nathaniel's empire. And then you came along, and suddenly I was just the uncle who'd never inherit anything. I was 8 years old, Eliza said, anger creeping into her voice. What could I possibly have done to you? You existed. The words came out flat and cold. You were proof that Nathaniel would always have something I never could. A child to carry on the family name. Someone to love him unconditionally. A legacy that would outlast his own life. Edgar moved closer, and Eliza could smell alcohol on his breath. He'd been drinking, which made him even more unpredictable. So you hired men to kidnap me. I hired men to take you for a few days while I negotiated with Nathaniel. He would have given me anything to get you back. Half the company. Control of the foundation. Whatever I asked for. Edgar's face twisted with old bitterness. But that interfering housekeeper ruined everything. Sylvia saved my life. Sylvia stole 20 years from me. Edgar exploded, spittle flying from his lips. 20 years of living with guilt. 20 years of watching Nathaniel mourn a daughter who was living happily with another woman. Do you have any idea what that did to me? You could have confessed. You could have told the truth and faced the consequences. And lose everything. Go to prison? Let Nathaniel know that his own brother had betrayed him? Edgar shook his head violently. I'd already lost too much. I wasn't going to lose what little I had left. Through her earpiece, Eliza could hear Morrison coordinating with the tactical teams. They had enough on tape to convict Edgar of conspiracy and kidnapping, but they needed him to admit to the murder attempts. What about the men you hired to kill me? Eliza asked. What about Lawrence Pike? Edgar's expression hardened. Loose ends. You should have stayed buried, Clara. You should have been content with your little life as Eliza Monroe. But no, you had to come back and ruin everything all over again. So you decided to finish what you started 20 years ago. I decided to protect what's mine. Edgar raised the gun, pointing it directly at her chest. The fortune, the company, the Ainsworth name, all of it should have been mine from the beginning, including the right to murder children. For a moment, something that might have been shame flickered across Edgar's features. I never wanted you dead, Clara. Not really. I wanted to matter. I wanted to be more than just Nathaniel's little brother who lived in the shadows. But you were willing to kill me to get it. Edgar's face crumpled, and for an instant, Eliza could see the frightened, jealous little boy he must have been once. I hired those men to scare Nathaniel, to make him realize how much he needed me. When they said they'd have to kill you to make it look real, I thought maybe it would be better if the world believed you were dead. Then Nathaniel would have to rely on me, and I'd finally have the place in his life I'd always wanted, even if it meant murdering your own niece. You weren't really my niece, Edgar said quietly. You were just another reminder of everything I'd never have. Through her earpiece, Morrison's voice was urgent. We've got enough. Teams are moving in now. But Edgar must have seen something in Eliza's expression, because his grip tightened on the gun. You're wearing a wire, aren't you? This whole thing is a setup. Edgar, please. 20 years too late for please, Clara. His finger moved to the trigger. I should have done this myself from the beginning. That's when the SWAT team burst through the front entrance, their tactical lights flooding the dim restaurant with harsh white illumination. Edgar spun toward the sound, his gun swinging away from Eliza for just a moment. It was all the opening the snipers needed. The first shot took Edgar in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his pistol skittering across the floor. He fell hard against a rusted counter, blood spreading across his shirt. Officer down. We need paramedics. Morrison's voice echoed through the space as tactical officers swarmed the building. But Eliza wasn't looking at the wounded Edgar or the celebrating police officers. She was staring at Nathaniel, who had somehow gotten past the perimeter and was running toward her with tears streaming down his face. Clara, are you hurt? Did he... I'm okay, she said, falling into his arms. It's over. It's finally over. Edgar was conscious, but fading fast as paramedics worked on his shoulder wound. As they strapped him to a gurney, he looked directly at Eliza, his eyes filled with something that might have been regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered, so quietly she almost missed it. "I'm sorry for all of it." Then he was gone, wheeled away to face surgery and a lifetime in prison. Detective Morrison approached, pulling off her tactical vest. "You did great in there. We got everything we needed. Conspiracy, kidnapping, attempted murder. Edgar Ainsworth is never going to see freedom again." "What happens now?" Eliza asked. Now you get to live your life without looking over your shoulder. You get to decide who you want to be, Clara Ainsworth or Eliza Monroe, or someone entirely new." As they walked out of the abandoned restaurant together, Nathaniel's arm around her shoulders, Eliza realized that for the first time in 20 years, she felt completely safe. The ghosts of her past had finally been laid to rest. But more importantly, she'd learned something crucial about herself. She wasn't just Clara Ainsworth, the kidnapped heiress, or Eliza Monroe, the waitress raised by a heroic woman. She was both, and neither. She was someone who'd been shaped by trauma and love, by loss and hope, by the worst and best of human nature. She was exactly who she was meant to be. The call came at 3:17 a.m., 3 days after Edgar's arrest. Eliza jolted awake in the guest room at Nathaniel's house, her heart pounding from another nightmare about men with guns and 20-year-old grudges. The ringing phone on the nightstand seemed unnaturally loud in the pre-dawn silence. "This is Detective Morrison. I'm sorry to wake you, but there's been a development." Eliza sat up, immediately alert. "What kind of development?" "Edgar's dead." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What? How?" "He was being transferred from the hospital to county lockup around midnight. According to the transport officers, he was ranting about someone following the ambulance, kept looking over his shoulder. When they got to the jail, he was in a full panic, begging not to be put in general population." "I don't understand. What happened?" Morrison's sigh carried over the phone line. "The intake process was routine. Medical check, property inventory, cell assignment. Edgar seemed to calm down once he realized he was going into protective custody. But when they were walking him to his cell, Detective," he stumbled. The officer said Edgar suddenly looked terrified, like he'd seen a ghost, started backing away from something, lost his footing on the stairs, fell down a full flight of concrete steps. Eliza felt something cold settle in her stomach. "You're saying it was an accident. Broke his neck on impact. Died instantly." Morrison paused. The ironic part. The staircase he fell down was one he'd personally overseen the construction of 5 years ago, part of a prison renovation project his company bid on. The connection clicked in Eliza's mind with horrible clarity. Edgar Ainsworth, who'd spent 20 years terrified that his past would catch up with him, had died falling down stairs he'd built himself. Poetic justice served by the universe's dark sense of humor. Was anyone else involved? That's what we're trying to determine. The officer swears Edgar just panicked and fell, but... Morrison trailed off. But what? Vincent Kowalski, the surviving gunman from the warehouse, was processed through the same facility 2 hours earlier. He would have been in holding when Edgar arrived. Eliza closed her eyes. Understanding immediately, Kowalski, the man Edgar had cheated out of payment 20 years ago, the man who'd spent 2 decades nursing a grudge, he wouldn't have needed to lay a hand on Edgar. Just being there, just letting Edgar see him, would have been enough to send an already panicked man over the edge. So what happens now? Now we close the books on one of the strangest cases I've ever worked. Edgar's confession is on record. The evidence is overwhelming, and the man responsible for Clara Ainsworth's disappearance is dead. Justice served, even if not in the way we expected. After hanging up, Eliza sat in the darkness for a long time, processing the news. Part of her felt relief. Edgar could never hurt anyone again, could never come after her or Nathaniel or anyone else. But another part felt something she hadn't expected. Pity. Edgar had been consumed by jealousy and resentment, had let those feelings turn him into a monster. But at his core, he'd been a broken man who'd never learned to find value in what he had, instead of coveting what others possessed. His death felt less like justice, and more like the final tragedy in a story full of them. When morning came, she found Nathaniel in the kitchen, staring at a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The news had reached him too. "How do you feel?" he asked as she poured herself coffee from the pot he'd made hours earlier. "Empty," she said honestly. "I thought I'd feel more, I don't know, closure, maybe, relief. Instead, I just feel tired." "He was my brother," Nathaniel said quietly. "For 53 years, he was my brother. I loved him, trusted him, relied on him, even after everything he did, even knowing what he was capable of. Learning he's dead still hurts." Eliza sat across from him at the kitchen table, studying the man who was slowly becoming familiar to her. In the past week, she'd learned that he took his coffee black, that he read 3 newspapers every morning, that he had a habit of humming old Beatles songs when he thought no one was listening. Small details that felt precious after 20 years of not knowing him at all. "What was he like?" she asked. "Before, when I was little." Nathaniel's expression softened with memory. "He was wonderful with you, patient in a way I never was, creative where I was practical. You used to call him Uncle Eddie, and he'd spend hours reading you stories or helping you with art projects. After your mother died, he stepped in without being asked. I honestly don't know how I would have managed without him." "What changed?" "I think the weight of pretending got to him. 20 years of acting like the grieving uncle. 20 years of watching me suffer over losing you. 20 years of living with what he'd done." Nathaniel shook his head sadly. "Guilt can poison a person from the inside out." The funeral was small, private, attended only by family and a few longtime business associates who remembered Edgar as he'd been before jealousy consumed him. Eliza stood beside Nathaniel at the graveside, watching as they lowered the casket of a man who'd tried to have her killed, and found herself unexpectedly moved, not for the Edgar who'd hired killers and orchestrated kidnappings, but for the uncle she couldn't remember, the man who'd once read her bedtime stories and helped her build sand castles on some long-ago beach. After the service, Lawrence Pike approached them, his head still bandaged but his eyes sharp as ever. "I wanted you to know," he said to Eliza. "We found the rest of Sylvia's evidence. She was thorough, kept records of everything, including Edgar's psychological state in the weeks before your disappearance." "What kind of records?" Pike handed her a manila folder. "Letters he wrote but never sent, mostly to your father, rambling things about feeling unappreciated, about deserving more recognition. She was documenting his decline, probably planning to warn Nathaniel if things got worse." Eliza flipped through the pages, seeing Edgar's handwriting grow increasingly erratic as the dates approached October 2004. The final entry was dated 2 days before her kidnapping. "And doesn't see me. Never has. I built half of everything he has. But I'm still just the little brother who gets table scraps. When Clara inherits, there won't even be scraps left. Maybe it's time to change the game." "She knew," Eliza said quietly. "Sylvia knew Edgar was planning something, but she couldn't prove it until the night it happened," Pike confirmed. "Then she had to make a choice. Try to stop it through official channels and risk your life. Or save you herself and deal with the consequences later. She saved me twice," Eliza realized. "Once from Edgar's hired killers, and once from a childhood of knowing my own uncle wanted me dead." That evening, as Nashville's skyline glittered beyond the mansion's windows, Eliza and Nathaniel sat in comfortable silence in what had once been Clara's playroom. The space had been converted to a home office years ago, but Nathaniel had moved the furniture out and brought back some of Clara's old toys. The dollhouse, the easel, the trunk full of dress-up clothes. "I've been thinking about what you said," Nathaniel said eventually, "about not wanting the inheritance. I meant it. This money, this house, the company. It's all built on 20 years of grief. I can't take comfort from something that caused so much pain. What if we changed what it represented?" Nathaniel leaned forward, his eyes bright with an idea that was clearly just forming. "What if instead of a memorial to what we lost, we made it a celebration of what we found?" "What do you mean?" "A foundation. In Sylvia's name. In Miriam's name. Something that helps missing children and the families searching for them. We could turn this fortune into something that prevents other families from going through what we did." Eliza felt tears prick at her eyes. It was perfect. A way to honor both the woman who'd saved her and the father who'd never stopped looking for her, while helping others who face similar nightmares. The Miriam Lowell Foundation. she said softly. "For missing children and the heroes who save them," Nathaniel added, as they sat planning how to transform tragedy into hope. Eliza realized that Edgar's death had given them something unexpected: the freedom to move forward without looking over their shoulders. The past would always be part of their story, but it no longer had the power to define their future. They were finally free to become the family they'd always meant to be. 3 months later, the morning sun filtered through the French doors of the mansion's breakfast room, casting golden patterns across the table where Eliza sat reading applications for the Miriam Lowell Foundation. Each file represented a family torn apart by tragedy, parents desperately searching for missing children, volunteers willing to dedicate their lives to bringing the lost ones home. "Find anything promising?" Nathaniel asked, settling into the chair across from her with his usual stack of newspapers and black coffee. "All of it," Eliza said, looking up from a letter written by a mother whose 6-year-old had vanished from a playground in Memphis. "How do you choose who gets help when everyone needs it? You don't choose. You help everyone you can, and you build the foundation strong enough to help more next year than you could this year." Nathaniel smiled, the expression transforming his face in a way that still surprised her. For so many years, she'd seen only sadness in his eyes. Now there was hope there, and purpose, and something that looked remarkably like peace. The relationship between them had evolved slowly, carefully, like a delicate plant growing in soil that had been barren for too long. They were father and daughter, but they were also two adults learning to know each other for the first time. Nathaniel had been patient with her memories that came in fragments, understanding when she called him by his first name instead of Dad, accepting that she needed time to grieve the life she'd lost even as she celebrated the life she'd found. "Speaking of building," Nathaniel continued, "the contractors finished the renovations on the Nashville office yesterday. Want to take a look?" The foundation's headquarters occupied the entire 4th floor of a downtown building that had once housed Ainsworth Construction's offices. Eliza had insisted on transforming Edgar's former workspace into something that would help heal the wounds his actions had created. Where Edgar had once planned business deals, social workers now coordinated searches for missing children. Where he'd conducted meetings with clients, counselors now provided support for grieving families. "It's perfect," Eliza said, walking through the bright, open spaces designed to feel welcoming rather than institutional. The walls were painted in warm earth tones, and natural light flooded in through floor-to-ceiling windows. Nothing about the space suggested the dark history that had made its existence possible. "Lawrence called this morning," Nathaniel said as they toured the family counseling center. "The FBI wants to consult with us on a case in Oregon. Seems our model is getting attention." Pike had become the foundation's chief investigator, bringing his decades of experience and his personal understanding of what it meant to never give up hope. His methods were unconventional, but his success rate was impressive. In 3 months, the foundation had helped locate 12 missing children and provided support services to 47 families. "What's the Oregon case about?" "Twin boys, age 7, vanished from their babysitter's house 6 months ago. Local police have exhausted their leads, but the parents refuse to give up." Eliza nodded, already mentally adding the case to their active files. She'd learned that hope was both fragile and incredibly resilient. It could be crushed by years of disappointment, but it could also survive against impossible odds, sustained by nothing more than a parent's refusal to believe their child was really gone. They had lunch at a small cafe near the foundation offices, the kind of unpretentious place Eliza had always felt comfortable in. She still lived simply, despite having access to more money than she could spend in 10 lifetimes. Her apartment was larger now, a 2-bedroom place in the Gulch with a view of the Cumberland River, but it was furnished with pieces from thrift stores and decorated with photographs rather than expensive art. "I've been thinking about Miriam's house," she said as they shared a piece of apple pie that reminded her of countless afternoons in the kitchen with her adoptive mother. "The one in Memphis where we lived together. What about it? I want to buy it. Turn it into a safe house for families who need to disappear temporarily while we investigate their cases." Eliza paused, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes the people looking for missing children aren't the ones who should find them. Nathaniel understood immediately. Not all missing children had been kidnapped by strangers. Some had been taken by family members fleeing domestic violence. Others had been hidden by parents protecting them from abuse. The Miriam Lowell Foundation helped find lost children, but it also helped keep safe the ones who needed to stay hidden. That's a beautiful way to honor her memory, Nathaniel said softly. That afternoon, Eliza drove out to the cemetery where Miriam was buried under her assumed name. She came here often, usually alone, to talk through the complexities of her new life with the woman who'd made it possible. "I got a letter from Mrs. Patterson today," she said, settling cross-legged on the grass beside the simple headstone. "Remember her? She lived next door when I was 12, always complained about our music being too loud. She saw the news stories about Clara Ainsworth being found, and she figured out who I really was. She wanted me to know that you were the best mother she'd ever seen. Said you turned a frightened, traumatized little girl into someone strong and kind and capable of anything." A warm breeze rustled the oak tree that shaded Miriam's grave, and Eliza imagined she could hear her adoptive mother's voice in the wind. "You were always capable of anything, sweetheart. I just helped you remember that. I'm not angry with you anymore," Eliza continued. "For the lies, for taking me away from Nathaniel, for all the years we spent running. I understand now that you did the only thing you could do. You saved me in every way a person can be saved, and you loved me enough to let me go when it was time." She stayed until the sun began to set, then drove back to the mansion that was slowly starting to feel like home. Nathaniel was in the garden, Clara's garden, tending to the roses that had somehow survived 20 years of neglect. "They're stronger than they look," he said when she joined him among the flower beds. "I thought they'd all died after you disappeared, but they just went dormant, waiting for someone to care for them again. Like you," Eliza said softly. "Like both of us." They worked together in comfortable silence as the Nashville skyline began to twinkle with evening lights. This garden had been Clara's favorite place to play, where she'd hosted tea parties for her dolls and painted pictures of butterflies and birds. Now it was where Eliza came to think, to plan, to dream about the future they were building together. "I've been thinking about changing my name legally," she said as they gathered up the gardening tools. "Not back to Clara. That little girl is gone, and I think that's okay. But maybe to Eliza Ainsworth, a way to honor both parts of who I am." Nathaniel stopped walking, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I think that's perfect. Clara Eliza Ainsworth was always your full name anyway. You'd just be choosing which part to use. Eliza Ainsworth it is then." That night, as she had every night since moving into the mansion, Eliza stood at her bedroom window looking out over the city where she'd been born, lost, found, and finally come home. Tomorrow would bring new cases for the foundation, new families to help, new children to find. There would be heartbreak and hope in equal measure, victories and defeats that would test her resolve. But tonight, she was simply a woman who'd learned that identity wasn't just about where you came from. It was about who you chose to become. She was Clara Ainsworth, the kidnapped heiress who'd been mourned for 20 years. She was Eliza Monroe, the waitress raised by a hero who'd sacrificed everything for love. And she was Eliza Ainsworth, the woman who'd turned tragedy into purpose and loss into hope. She was exactly who she was meant to be. In the distance, church bells chimed midnight, marking the end of another day and the beginning of whatever came next. Eliza smiled and closed the curtains, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. After 20 years of running from the past, she was finally ready to embrace the future,